Rufaro, thank you for coming here.
Thank you for having me.
You are my first guest, so I'm so excited to chat to you. I think when I hear your story, it's one of relentless curiosity and impact.
Yeah.
And I would love for everyone to hear your story. You studied to be an epidemiologist, and then you transitioned to a journalist, and then a consultant, and now a public health strategist for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I find this story so fascinating. I would love to know what was like the turning points that led you down each path.
Yeah. So often when I say I'm an epidemiologist by training, people think I'm a dermatologist, just skin, completely different. But an epidemiologist is a public health professional who specializes essentially in patterns and the distribution of disease, right? And I always say you can really drill it down to just two things, which is studying exposures and the outcomes that it has essentially on health. So if you think about at a time many, many decades ago, smoking was a really big thing. It was trendy. It was, and then a couple of folks got together, doctors at the time, and they were starting to see that most of the patients that were coming in to see them with sort of respiratory issues, weird coughs and all of that had one thing in common. Right. And they were all smokers. And so that was sort of the beginnings of starting to look at if someone is exposed to something, what kind of health outcome can that result in? And of course, now we know that there's a strong association between smoking and lung cancer and other cancers as well.
Right.
But that is a good example of what I like to give to folks just in terms of demonstrating what epidemiologists do. Great. So they spend a bunch of time looking at very many exposures, and there are many, right, in our environment, but even just genetically as well, and saying if someone is exposed to this or to that, what are some of the health outcomes that we can expect? And of course, epidemiologists are always front and center when it comes to outbreaks, epidemics. If you think about COVID, that was both medical doctors, frontline workers, working epidemiologists who are responding to outbreaks, trying to figure out where did this originate, how is it spread? And so all the modeling around, this is how you can get COVID, this is the mode of transmission, and all of those things epidemiologists are usually involved in. So that's in a nutshell what an epidemiologist does.
That's freaking awesome. So, what made you want to study to be an epidemiologist?
Yeah. I think with a number of things in the beginning of my career, I stumbled into them. But so I started off in the lab. So my foundation is in molecular biology. So essentially, I like to explain that as anything that happens at the molecular or the cellular level, right? So if a doctor gives you Panado, you know that it's going to sort of address pain receptors, and after a couple of minutes, you're not going to have a headache anymore. But molecular biologists can extend to a cellular level why that's actually happening, right? So that's where I started. And I did my undergrad at Wits. And then I did my honors specifically in microbiology and biotechnology. But honestly, being in the lab was great in some regards, but it was also tedious for me. And so I think really what was sort of the point at which I decided, nah, this is not for me.
Right.
I had to do, so I was doing a really cool project. I was looking at a specific strain of bacteria called Bacillus castani, that's known to produce heavy metal nanoparticles. And you can apply that sort of in acid mine drainage if you're trying to remove heavy metals from water sources, right, essentially. And so it was a really cool project, was trying to get this bacterium to produce gold nanoparticles specifically. And then there was an even bigger component of that where I was using some electron microscopy, right, some really big microscopes
Yeah.
to essentially look at nanoparticles, right? And it was amazing. But I remember I did what's called a growth study. So essentially what I needed to figure out was when this bacterium is exposed to a gold solution, because that's what it uses to make gold nanoparticles, at what point does it actually die, right? So the growth study sort of maps out every 2 hours, these are the kinds of nanoparticles that are being made. And then at a certain point in time, because you're doing spec readings, essentially passing through, light through solutions, you can then sort of get a sense of the bacteria have now died, right? They've sort of reached a critical mass. that I had to take measurements every 2 hours for 72 hours, which meant that I didn't get any sleep. So, of course, I slept in part during that 72-hour period for about maybe, I think after every 8 or 12 hours, I would have someone relieve me for 4 hours so that I could take a nap and then I come back into the lab. I was sleeping in the lab trying to take these readings. And the thing about the lab is running experiments never goes as you expect it to, right? And so by the end of my honors, had a really great project, did well, but the thought of doing a master's in microbiology and just being in the lab wasn't something that filled me with great enthusiasm. And at the time, I felt like I wanted to shift to something else that I didn't know what exactly. And so oftentimes, and I've done this since I was younger, when I don't know what to do, I don't do anything, right? Oprah says this, if you don't know what to do nothing. And so I took a gap year. And in that gap year, I was writing. I had started sort of freelance writing when I was a, student politics leader in the varsity space. So I freelanced for that year. And I knew two things. One, I wanted to study disease. I just didn't know in what form. And two, I was a real nerd about statistics. So I was trying to find something that would combine those two things, or that would also get me a lot closer to people. Because when you're in the lab, it's just you. Yes, you had lab mates, but when you're running experiments, it's just you and those test tubes, and you're running these experiments in triplicate. So I didn't want that tedium in the work that I would do. And so I did a bit of research, right? If you're interested in disease and if you're interested in statistics, if you're interested in outbreaks, what do you do? And that's sort of where epidemiology kind of surfaced for me. And found out that WITS had a program with epidemiology. And yeah, applied for that. And then I started my master's in epidemiology. So I always say that I've a trained epidemiologist, but I've actually never practiced as an epidemiologist. So that's always the caveats that I give people.
And then you said you went into journalism.
Yeah.
And I would actually love to ask you about your favorite pieces that you got to write about, and also just um, I think the profoundness of the job and the experiences that you got to have while being a journalist.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So maybe how I actually got into it, because a lot of people say, "Son, well, you're a scientist,
Yeah.
you are also a journalist." And again, I stumbled into that, right? So I was at WITS, started 2013, my first year. Then 2015, we had Fees 4.
Yes.
And, thankfully, I was always a scholarship baby. So getting through university has always been sponsored by an Alibre Orbis or a Matilda Rhodes Foundation.
One of the best scholarships, actually.
You know. Um, but I was also precisely aware that had I not had those scholarships, I would not have been able to go to university because one, my father had passed away, but also two, my family just were not able to afford it, right? So I had tremendous gratitude that I could even get those scholarships because they were, in essence, my one way ticket into university. And so Fees Must Fall comes around 2015. And, essentially a lot of students, but primarily Black students, are saying we're smart, we're capable, but we can't get in because we're poor. We don't have the money, right? And I think this idea around being talented and capable, and the only stumbling block that's in front of you is how much money you have in your pocket or how much money your family has, essentially, was something that really struck a chord with me. Because again, I lost my dad in time where our family had pretty much lost everything and we didn't have money. And oftentimes I feel like the deciding factor for my dad not having had the care that he needed, and not being here today is simply because we didn't have money. And I don't think that's a good enough um, sort of thing in this world, the folks to not be able to access certain things, especially that will bring tremendous benefit to their lives. And it's completely founded on how much money they have. So anyways, it was a movement that it really struck a chord with me. And again, I knew whilst I was a scholarship baby that had I not had those scholarships, I would have been just like any other student who was not able to afford,
Right.
right, access to tertiary education. And so the movement started, there were protests, there was a bunch of things happening. I think it's one of the most pivotal moments we had in this country, probably since the uprisings in Soweto, I think in 1976. Um, but I remember, there was a time where, there were different people, there were thousands of students that were part of this movement at WITS, at other universities across, the country, UP, UJ, TUT, DUT, all of them, right? And at a certain point in time, as with any movement, right, especially political movement, there were divergent views. So there were students who wanted to sort of push for certain things, or there were others who felt like, you don't have the leverage. We can't do that right now. We're not going to succeed. And so there was a little bit of a rift within the student community. And at the time, I had been involved at WITS in a bunch of, student politics forums. So not the SRC, but there was a body called the Student Forum, essentially at WITS at the time, which was the body that was meant to keep the SRC accountable, right? And because there were all these divergent views, and I certainly had mine, right? I found myself tremendously just conflicted, about the things that were happening, some of the tactics that would be used, by students. And I think for the first time wanted to just have an outlet to say, hey, this is what I think. These are some of the things that I'm struggling to contend with. And that's where writing sort of started for me. And at the time, there was a Pan-African publication called OK Africa based in New York, but they had this really diverse pool of freelance writers. And they actually reached out through a friend that I had at the time, and they said, lots happening on the student politics front in South Africa. And instead of sort of writing from an outside in perspective, we really want to hear from folks on the ground. And so I think the first piece that I ever wrote and that was published was called it was called Fees Must Fall, Where Do We Go From Here? And it really was just talking about some of the things that I was struggling with, some of the things that I didn't understand, but also what were my hopes for the movement, right? And we would get the students, sort of after the protests and all of that had, been done, what was it materially that we wanted to achieve, right, as a student body? And that was the first piece that I ever had published. And from there on, started writing initially a lot about student politics and what was happening. But they also, as someone who, identifies as, I always say, a feminist scholar, really started writing about things that were close to my heart, things that I would observe in the world that I was trying to make sense of through a feminist lens, how women were treated, things like gender-based violence. Was interested in how politics, which is often this very abstract concept to so many people, really plays out in our real lives, right? It's more than just the politicians who sit in parliament and pass these bills and do all these things. It's about how does it affect lived realities, right? It's not just sort of this thing that we can cast aside. It's a tremendous part of our lives, whether we care to admit it or not, right? And so wrote about the things that I cared about, but more so the things that I was trying to make sense of. Um, and yeah, I think that's where my journey with writing and being published as a writer started. Wow. So by the time I started my master's in 2018 for epidemiology, because I'm still a science student, that's what I do, that's what I know. Right. There was an opportunity to start writing for OK Africa as a full-time writer. And I took it up. I wanted to explore where writing could take me. But at the same time, I was still very much invested in getting my master's. I knew at a point in time I'd eventually end up in the health space because, again, the story of my dad, right? And wanting to make sure that I could have some kind of positive influence in terms of public health in South Africa, but on the continent, right? That was sort of my long-term goal and where I saw my career ultimately heading. But for the now, I was interested, I was curious, I was passionate about writing stories. And so that's what I did for 3 years. And so in terms of my favorite pieces, I'd written a lot. Yes. I think to date, I've written something like in excess of 1,000 articles, and that was over a span of 6 years.
That's incredible.
It's a lot when you think about it, right? And some have been short, commentary pieces around, the culture scene, music, literature. Others have been interviews. Others have been features. It's been a plethora of things that I've written. But I think, one of my favorite pieces, again, was looking at the politics on the continent. And I think it was titled liberation parties and the politics of nostalgia. And where that had come from really was, I think we were going through elections here in South Africa. And as you know, at the time, well, for a very long time, the ANC had been, the major political party, had always gotten the majority vote. But again, there was always a sense of invoking Mandela's name time and time again in a way that I felt that the ANC that existed when Mandela was still there and the ideals that it held true were not necessarily, the case sort of years later. But again, the invocation of his name was sort of this playing on nostalgia. Remember what happened, when we had our first democratic election. Remember when Mandela walked out of prison. Remember when we thought about the ideals of a rainbow nation, but not really speaking to some of the present realities, right, that we've had to experience as South Africans. There are still the majority of South Africans who live as they did under apartheid, context or settings. And the only thing that's really changed is that now they can be in the same shop as white people. They can sit on the same bench. They can use the same facilities. They can go to the same schools. They can be in the same workplaces, but they still don't have things like running water. They don't live in houses that are essentially deemed fit for people to live in, right? And yet we still call it housing. And years later, the promise of democracy for all is still not realized for so many South Africans, particularly Black South Africans. Right. And so it was taking the context within South Africa, but also looking at, Zimbabwe, which, as a South African-Zimbabwean and this dual heritage, very similar context there where, yes, we've had a change in president since, Robert Mugabe, who was in power for about 3 decades as well, since his passing. But in essence, the regime has not changed, right? So you still have ZANU-PF, which again was a liberation party, right? Won independence for Zimbabwe from the British colonial rule. And yet, if you look at the state of Zimbabwe socioeconomically, politically, right, so bad and continues to be on a decline. And again, having a regime that continues to invoke the sense of nostalgia. Remember what we did for you back then. Remember how we won you your freedom. But again, when you look at present day and what's happening in terms of governance, worlds apart, right? And the same thing happening in Botswana as well. Well, thankfully they have a new president and there's a lot of enthusiasm and excitement around that. But it was looking at the continent and saying, given a continent that's gone through colonialism in one shape or the other, right? There has been this trend of liberation parties and independence and the promise of what could be. And many of those promises had not been kept up until now. And so it was really wanting to say, this is the state of politics currently, but this is the nostalgia that they often draw on to get votes. So that's to date, I think, one of my favorite pieces, because I think it was something that was important to express, especially as a Yabo person, right? But also secondly, I think it was one of the pieces that I'll personally admit or acknowledge that I wrote particularly well. As a writer, to acknowledge sort of when I started out and I read some of my old stuff, I'm like, the idea was there, but perhaps the use of language, the craft, you're still a baby writer, so you're figuring a lot of things out. You're trying to find your voice. But when I look at that piece, I think it really sort of represents me being at the height of what it means to be a good writer. You're right. So that's one of my favorite pieces. I think another piece that I wrote was around the Zimbabwean Lives Matter movement. And so for the really first time in Zimbabwean history, we had the youth and activists rising up against the regime, which is something you don't see happening oftentimes in Zimbabwe just because of, the regime and sort of how it goes about instilling fear in citizens. And was really just reminding people that, oftentimes when we talk about Zimbabwe, it's about, oh, the Zim dollar and inflation and how much does it cost, to buy a loaf of bread in Zim, or the current, the constant currency changes, or just the difficulty, right, that people often encounter just living in Zim on a day-to-day. And for the first time, the narrative was about writing about the courage of Zimbabwean people, right? There's so many things that have happened under successive um, regimes in Zimbabwe, and many of which people don't know about, right? So it was really about saying this is a critical time in history, and it was an inflection point because oftentimes the narrative is often, well, Zimbabweans wanted things to change in their countries, they should protest, they should do this, but not understanding that the consequences of that in a country like that versus in a country like this, where we still see, things like police brutality and all of that, are far worse, right? And so folks often, not because they want to, but because that's all they have, decide to keep quiet, go about their days. They try to eke out a living as best as they can under terrible economic, situations. And I think it was a moment in time that I really was proud to be, Zimbabwean, and was also very privileged to just write about the many stories, right, that were happening on the ground. They weren't also getting out because there was an internet shutdown and, folks were trying to suppress information, coming out from the country. So I think just the collation of the different stories that came out of that movement, people who were being arrested, who were being jailed, who were being tortured, um, I think was an important piece because, again, I think the function of storytelling is just allowing stories to be heard that would otherwise not be heard because of different sort of forces in this world. And I think it remains a tremendous privilege to be able to tell anyone else's story when ideally they should, be able to tell their own stories. So I think those would be probably two that I can think of, off the top of my head that have been my favorite pieces to date.
I love that. From what I'm hearing as well is a lot of the things that you do are very principle based.
Yeah.
Were you not afraid when publishing these stories that you might get some sort of criticism?
Yeah. Yeah, I think like Steve Biko famously said, I write what I like.
Right.
And I didn't, work for a traditional news media company, right? So I wrote for a publication that really gave me carte blanche to write what I wanted to write about, right? And so just that freedom as well to tell the story the way that I wanted to tell it, to frame the narrative in the way that I wanted, was tremendously liberating. They were stories that yeah, at certain points in time, I, wondered, sure, I think as a writer, you always wonder, what is someone reading this going to think? And it's more from sort of the critical lens of, are they going to think it's a good piece? I certainly have had people in the past say, oh, you shouldn't have written about that. That doesn't matter, right? But it mattered to me. And I knew that given the universality of stories, that it would matter to someone else, even if it was just one other person. And that's why I wrote the stories that I did. But there were certainly other stories. And I remember at the time where, American singer R. Kelly was, sort of peak controversy, was in the media. And I think it was at the time where he had been arrested, right? I wrote a piece around, because there was this mute R. Kelly movement that was happening where people were really starting to say, in essence, it was a conversation around separating the art from the artist, right? Saying if you continue to listen to R. Kelly's music, particularly in the day of streaming, right, where that is actual, equivalent to sales of music, right? You're just not selling CDs anymore. You're contributing to someone who continues to cause harm to others, right? And at a point in time, we have to ask ourselves, is the consumption of art at the detriment of others really something that we want to be participating in, especially when, the documentation, right, of that person's harms to other people in society is there and it continues to be there, right? And so I then wrote a piece more so within a South African context where I was saying there's this new to R. Kelly movement that's happening, that we have a lot of similarly problematic male artists in the music space in South Africa. And so whilst we're saying new to R. Kelly, what is our perspective on those individuals? And I actually called individuals out, right, who had been in the media very many times for uh, rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, physical assault of their partners, or just, women who are on their teams, on tour, whatever the case was. So it was already in the media. I was just bringing a spotlight to say, if we're going to talk about this one man, we also need to be, sort of critiquing our own house and saying, we can't sort of relegate this American singer but think that we can still sort of promote problematic musicians in our own country, right? And I remember after that article was published, and I can't remember the title, but it was something along the lines of, if we're willing to mute R. Kelly, we should be, willing to mute our own South African male artists, right? And there are a couple of musicians that I called out, right, specifically in that art, but I won't mention their names because they're quite litigious. And I think it was a day or two after that publication was up on the site. Remember logging into my emails, and there was sort of in the email header in all caps, right? I think it was the title of the article, exclamation marks. I was wondering, what is this? And I opened the email, and it was from a very well-known DJ in this country, right? And he had written this furious email that this article was baseless, and charges had never been, filed against him, which was not true. They had, and they had been dropped. And the person that he had physically assaulted had written a book about this incident, and he, in essence, had attempted to gag her. And so, in the second run of this book, in the printing out of it, they had removed the section where she talks about the abuse that she had suffered at the hands of this musician. And so he's essentially saying that, there's nothing in the courts of law against me, no charges standing. And so you can't write about this thing, right? And he said, I'm giving you 24 hours. If this article is not pulled down, we're going to have our, lawyers address this. And of course, I think at the time I was 24 years old. Yes. When I put out this article. And I was shaking, not because I felt that there was anything wrong with the article, because again, I write an article and there's tremendous oversight. There's a managing editor, there's an editor-in-chief, there's legal as well, right? So before an article like that goes, on the site, we've ticked, gone through the checks and balances, but I was still nervous because he sent this email to the CEO of the company and everyone in CCApping that he could think of who works at the company. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. So I then write an email to my managing editor, editor-in-chief, the CEO, and I say, this was my reasoning for writing the articles. This was my evidence base.
You all stood by.
I stood by it, absolutely. And I stood by it, right? So I wasn't sort of retracting and saying, "Oh, no. I stood by it," and I was saying things on my reasons for standing by it. And of course, so most of the team was based in New York. So when I'm opening this email in the morning, they're only going to see it about 6 or 7 hours late.
So there's this
So there's
anxiety in between all that.
anxiety, and I'm struggling to work. Should I continue working on the pieces that I'm working on now? What do I do? Um, so by the time, New York morning time rolls around, my managing editor, sends me a text. He's like, don't worry, we're having legal look at it again. My editor-in-chief, they send me a note. They're like, don't worry about it. Because I think, I was pretty young at the time. So they had seen this, a bunch of times. I mean, if you're going to write about something that's seen as being controversial and that's calling people out, there's going to be a little bit of reaction to that.
And I approved of it. You wake up the right person. Yes.
Absolutely. And so one of the things that was interesting, that my managing editor said to me was, if this was a serious threat, it wouldn't have come from him, it would have come from his label team. And then I was like, oh.
Yeah.
So that also reassured me. And then just having conversations with them when they were like, we're going to keep the article up. And we did. The article is still up to this day.
That's freaking amazing.
I
didn't do anything.
He couldn't do anything, right? He didn't have a leg to stand on. Who was he going to sue, me or the company? And he couldn't sue me because, again, it wasn't a sort of a salacious opinion piece that I wrote. It was founded in facts that had been reported in the media, right? It was my framing around this is what's happening in an American context around some of these male singers and drawing parallels to what was happening in South Africa and, the border continent, right? And so never heard from him again. Then there was a second incident where I was writing again about a male artist who had been accused by sort of a counterpart, a female counterpart, was also in the music business. And
Right.
at the time they had been dating, and she had come out publicly saying that he had sexually assaulted her right during their relationship. And so I covered quite a bit around, the allegations when she didn't file charges and sort of followed up on that. But was reporting from a purely factual basis. This is what she has said. This is how he has responded. These are some of the things that are happening through the courts. There was another incident as well when we had another known male musician. So this is beyond the first piece, right? That has had this reaction by the DJ. There's now this other incident where, this female artist comes out and says, this is what happened to me at the hands of this other male artist. Then there's this third incident, right, where there's another very well-known, very vibrant, young female musician. She was really doing good at the time. Also, they'd had, a very live moment because she actually captured the physical assault happening on her Instagram live. So it wasn't even a contention of did it happen, did it not happen. It was captured live and everyone saw it, right? And so I would cover these stories, right? But at the time, it was largely around fact-based reporting. And then there will be a couple of pieces where I'd be sort of exploring what's happening within the entertainment industry as a whole, tying it to gender-based violence, which remains, a real scourge in South Africa. And that was sort of what I would write on. And I remember um, I got a DM on Twitter from one of these male musicians,
Right.
um, essentially intimidating me, right? And I think that was the first time that, because I'd been sent an email, but that had been addressed and Vigo had been involved, that someone had come to my personal Twitter, sent me a DM because they have seen a bunch of the articles that I've been writing, reporting on what's happening. And yeah, it was not great. And he blocked the person, spoke about it very publicly, saying that this person is trying to intimidate me. But I think it was a moment where I kind of wondered, will this be something that escalates beyond just Twitter? If they find out where our office is, could they rock up or could they send someone, right? Because also we live in South Africa, right? Where very many things happen. Someone can always send someone after you. And I started actually really thinking about my safety for the first time in a very real way. And, spoke to a couple of other, women in the space, writers who'd also got through similar things. And they were sort of supportive, reassuring. But I think that was the first time I genuinely felt some type of way about my safety. And nothing ever happened beyond that, but the fact that someone had decided that because I have written something that they didn't like, that they were now going to come into my personal space and, in essence, sort of make it clear that if you continue, that it will go beyond just a DM on Twitter. That was frightening. Yeah, it is. It is. But nothing ever happened beyond that. And to be quite honest, I don't think I could have stopped even if I wanted to. I always say, and interestingly enough, I think a year or two after that, the reasons why I eventually left OK Africa was because then we had this really big sort of thing happening with our CEO, had been a really toxic workplace for Black women, essentially, who had all been fired. And then there were sexual assault allegations that had come against, the CEO, and essentially that he was fired and they brought in another CEO. And that's the time that I did had left. But during that time as well, again, still very young, right? 24, 25, had seen all of these women being fired around me. And I was like, this is not right. This can't be a thing, right? And there wasn't very much I could do because in New York, the employee labor laws look very different to what they look like in South Africa, of course. But when it finally happened to an employee and a fellow colleague who was in the South Africa office, just fired on a whim, access revoked, all of that, that really riled me up. And I remember, at the time he had Slack, and that was sort of the communication channel that, the company, used. And we're a fairly small company, right? But I remember writing a Slack after this incident had happened, and I was just outraged that this is not how you treat people, and this is not how you treat people given the laws of this country, right? And I remember tagging the CEO because I wanted him to know that I was sending this message directly to him, but I also wanted it to be on a public enough platform within the company for folks to know that this is what's happening and it's not okay. And I remember the next day, I was at a disciplinary hearing. The CEO was there. My editor-in-chief, who happened to be a Black woman, by the way, was there. My managing editor at the time.
In New York.
From New York.
Okay.
I think our chief operating officer was there as well. And my remaining colleague in the South Africa office was also on that call. And I'll never forget it. The CEO said to me, the next time you pull a stunt like that, I'm going to fire you, right? Oh, my goodness. I think that's been one of the Yeah, one of the scariest moments in my sort of career, I was this is my first job, remember?
Yes.
And I did it because it was the right thing to do.
Mm.
And everyone was observing this man treating people other than they should be treated, firing Black women on the basis of prejudice. And I just couldn't sit back and say, it's okay, I'm just going to keep my head down and continue moving. I had to say something. If nothing else, I had to say something. And even when I said it, I was aware that there would be consequences for, right? But what ensued after that for me was just a period of just depression because I there felt really isolated within the company. I was the only one who had spoken up, young as I was, and was told that I was being disrupted, that I was not focusing on my own work. Um, I really had a target on my back after that incident. And so went into this really deep depression. And at the time, my partner that I was seeing at the time would often, come into the bathroom when I was taking a bath, and he would actually have to physically lift me out of the bathtub, and he would dry me down, clothe me, put me into bed. And I just went through a couple of months of just wondering, did I do the wrong thing? Should I have kept quiet? Yeah, it was a should I have kept quiet? But I knew fundamentally that this woman who had been fired had children, she had a family, she had responsibilities. And I'd also observed how she'd been treated throughout the couple of months that she'd been at the company. So I knew what it wasn't wrong. But I couldn't understand why folks who are much older than me and also in positions of leadership, because I was just a writer, right? In positions of leadership, one chose to throw me under the bus. This, in essence, says it's your problem. You're the provenant child, right? Um, so just went through almost a little bit of an existential crisis where I was like, did I do the right thing? Was it not the right thing? Feeling like it was the right thing. Was it the wrong approach? But given the situation, we didn't have HR at the company, so I couldn't escalate. No one could escalate anything through HR because we didn't have HR to begin with. And this was not the first time this has happened. This was probably the fifth or the sixth time was the first time that was happening to a South African employee. So really struggled in that job after that, not from the work that I actually did, the stories that I wanted to tell, but more so from the politics of the organizations, especially that CEO. Um, and in essence, fast forward to George Floyd movements, Black Lives Matter movement happens in the US, and you had a lot of organizations, sticky media organizations coming out saying, we support the George Floyd movement. We stand in solidarity with, Black people, Black Americans. And what then started to happen was almost a reckoning within the media space in America because a lot of the Black employees who were working for those organizations issue these statements would say, we're not treated like that within the company. This is what's happening with you. That's
Hypocrisy.
the hypocrisy, right? And then the woman that had all been fired in New York from the New York office, the Black woman, they then came out very publicly to say this is what's happening at OK Africa, as well as OK Clear, which is sort of the sister publication that the Roots had actually sort of set up, like the music band The Roots. They had set up OK Clear, and was supposed to be this archive of Black American culture. And then sort of the sister publication to that was OK Africa, which had focus on the continent, right? So these women came out on social media, and that's where things started to fall apart. And I think within 3 or 4 weeks, the CEO was fired because then you also had concomitant sexual allegations made against him from clients, not even employees, right? So when that all came to a hilt, I then, thankfully, this is also COVID is happening, just a lot is happening. Then graduate with my master's, and then I then use that as an opportunity to go into the health space because again that was always my long-term vision. But that's sort of how the writing started, what I did when I was there, some of the challenges that I experienced and threats that came with some of the more controversial pieces that I wrote. And I always hesitate calling it controversial because for me it was truth telling, right? And I feel like that there's a difference. And how I eventually left the publication and then moved into the health space.
The question I want to ask is, I think a lot of people actually struggle to do the right thing because of the consequences that come with it. You have never struggled to do that. No matter the fact that your job was on the line,
Yeah.
that your own safety was in the line,
Yeah.
What can you attribute that to?
I think it's a great question because I don't know if it's any one thing that I can point to. Of course, I've had, great parents. And, you're taught to do the right thing. When you're much younger, you're taught between right and wrong. Uh, and your parents also do the best that they can, right, in terms of sort of instilling certain values, in you. But I think at a certain point in time, because again, we're not sort of these I don't know, many copies of our parents. We're autonomous beings that, have the liberty to make our own decisions, decide our own moral compass and value systems and all the rest. I think I don't know. I really don't know. I think it could be a confluence of things. When I was much younger, I think all throughout primary school and certainly throughout secondary school, I was teased and I was bullied endlessly, right? It wasn't little things about, oh, your hair. It was just deep bullying, right? And I always say the first time that I really got into a particularly dark, depressive space, I was from maybe in ninth grade, right? And I had just been bullied all of primary school and then bullied all of high school, probably except for grade 11 and grade 12, which is matric. Um, and so there was always a sense of feeling what was happening to me wasn't okay, but they weren't necessarily structures or even people that did anything to sort of stand up for me
Or validate.
or
Yes.
validate what I was going through, right? And so I think maybe in the solitude of all of that, right, you kind of decide the kind of person you want to be, but more especially the kind of person you don't want to be, you know? So I didn't want to be a bully. I didn't want to ever tease or ridicule or be condescending towards anyone, right? And based off of anything, right? Whether it was how they looked, where they were from, um, how they presented themselves, whatever the case was, I didn't want to be that person. So perhaps maybe that was the beginnings of sort of a righteous anger towards some of the things that had happened to me all throughout my childhood and adolescence, but not having had anyone to essentially protect me from all of that happening, right? Not teachers. My parents did the best that they could. They were always at school trying to speak to the principal, trying to speak to teachers, that nothing was ever maturely done to get kids to stop bullying me. Um, and I think, again, by the time I get to varsity and then witnessing things like fees must fall and being really a part of that, right? Again, it was a sense of there's an injustice that's happening here, right? And it's not enough for us to say, well, that's not how the world works. And, if you don't have the money, then you're just not going to go to varsity. Knowing the kind of trajectory that individuals often have if they do have the opportunity to access tertiary education, right? And seeing that the majority of the students who were not able to access tertiary education or who were struggling on the basis of financial circumstance were Black. Again, that riled me up, right? So I think perhaps my own beginnings was the stuff that I sort of went through as a young kid, but also certainly the things that I was observing in the world. Um, I think also sort of helped me start shaping what I kind of wanted to be a part of in terms of if something is not right, if something is amiss, if there is an injustice, I certainly have never wanted to be on the side of the wrong side, essentially. I've always wanted to be on the side of justice um, and to do the right thing. So I think there are a bunch of things over time that have helped certainly shape that and maybe reinforce it. And it's not that it hasn't been scary in those moments, right? It's a very scary thing to be told by a CEO of any company that, the next time you do that, I'm going to fire you, right? And it's not just an idle threat. He means it. Um, it's a scary thing, right, to be part of a movement where police are shooting at you. And there were students that died, right? There were students that were harmed. Um, but to still say, even when you're afraid, right? Courage is not doing something because of the absence of fear, right? I think it's doing something in spite of the fear. And so I've always sooner leaned into, yes, I'm scared. Yes, I'm afraid, but this is the right thing to do. And if nothing else, right? I think sort of at the end of my time here on this planet, I wanted to be said that I always tried to do the right thing and I always wanted to tell the truth. So I think those two tenets have really made it easier in many very difficult, complex situations to just say, this is the right thing to do. And you're aware of the potential repercussions of doing the right thing, but you do it anyway. And if nothing else, it's less for everyone else who's observing, the decision that you're making or whatever it is that you're deciding to do, and more so about being able to just sit within myself and know from a conscience perspective that I'm good. That when the right thing needed to be done, I did it or I was a part of it, versus sitting on the other side of things and being filled with tremendous regret and saying, I wish I had done the right thing.
Right.
Yeah.
You say that you also suffered a period of depression from doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And a lot of people think that just because you did the right thing, you're constantly reminded of these principles, that things are going to be A-okay.
Yeah.
But you went through this depressive period. What is the thing that allowed you to get out of it? Even though you knew it was the right thing,
Yeah.
you still fell into this state of depression.
Yeah. I think so. I think it's a couple of things. One is the right support structure, right? So at the time when, I was navigating all of these things happening at the publication I was working for, right, OK Africa, had a really supportive partner, right? Who understood that even before I had that depressive episode, I have clinical depression, right? And so super stressful things at times will be triggers, right? And that was certainly one of them. And he just stuck a course with me, right? Really reminding me that you did the right thing. And sometimes in the moment, you're like, I did the right thing, but you can kind of get lost and you're like, yes, it was the right thing, but why was I the one, right? To decide I'm going to do it, right? And someone else could have done it. And even if they didn't, why was it on me, right? And why did I decide to put a lot at stake, right? Because if I was fired, how was I going to pay for rent? How was I going to pay for medical aid and all the things that we worry about, right? When it comes to finances. But I had someone who constantly reassured me that she did the right thing. And this too shall pass, right? I've always had a super supportive mother. I always say, oof, my mom is, and I know we all feel generally speaking, and many of us feel this way about our parents, that my mom has been incredible regardless of whatever the situation has been, right? So, I told her, oh, this is what I'm planning to do. And then I did it. And she didn't say to me, no, don't do that. It was just, I understand that she supported that, right? When I'd made some really tough career decisions or left jobs from a values-based perspective, my mom has always been the first one to cheer me on, right? So just having that support system, I think, was critical to getting me through. So I didn't get through it by myself. There were folks in my corner and friends as well, really deep friendships where people are like, you did the right thing. I think the second part is, and it's not that this always happens in life, but oftentimes it does. And Martin Luther King says this, or he said this at some point. He said that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it eventually bends towards justice, right? And it's something that I continued to tell myself, right? That maybe in this moment, um, you're not going to be vindicated, and that's okay, right? But you have to just remember that you did the right thing, right? Um, and I think a couple months after that, when all of these things started surfacing about the CEO and that was exposed to the investors and all these other things that we had never anticipated also started being publicized, right? If he was fired, it was a vindicating moment, right? Because all of the risks that I had taken, personal risks, right, felt like they were worthwhile, but I also knew that they would have still been worthwhile even if he hadn't been fired, even if all of those things hadn't come to the fore. But it certainly was a moment that was vindicating for me. And I always say one of the things that happened was, the woman that came out very publicly during that media reckoning in the US, then filed a lawsuit against the company for everything that they had been, put through, the unfair and unlawful dismissals, all of that. And it was a 2-year lawsuit, right? Um, and at the time when they had initially come out on social media, there were folks who just sort of relegated them to being disgruntled employees, right? That were just sort of kicking up a fuss because they had been fired, right? And I remember being quite militant on, Twitter, saying that these are not just disgruntled employees. I too had been experiencing XYZ, being a part of this company. And I was still at the company when I was tweeting these things, or what I was on at the time. Right? When I look about my younger self, I'm like, whew, right? And 2 years later, they actually won their lawsuit, right? That's incredible. And I remember at the time, I think this is the second almost like vindicating thing for me, that it always makes me feel teary. I was in Addis at the time, so now I was a consultant. I was working at a management consulting firm. And I was in Addis working for an institution. They were doing their strategy refresh, and it was super early in the morning. I was down in the dumps because I had long nights, early mornings. I was sick as well. Um, and I remember one of the girls, because we had this group, sent me a message and she just said, hey, please send me your email address. And I thought, because I'd said to them, not particularly happy as a consultant right now, so trying to pivot and find my next. So, even if it's in writing or if it's in, the health space, let me know. So I just thought she wanted my email address, because there was an opportunity she wanted to send through. Um, and then I remember before I left my hotel room to go to the client's site, checking my emails just like very casually, and I had an email from her. And I remember opening the email, and it said that her name is Sina, and she's since passed on. But she had sent me 100,000 rand. And I remember being so confused. And I was like, wait, what's happening? And I remember sitting at teeth, I'm like, wait, what's happening? And I remember her saying, in the group that we had, it's just a token of our appreciation because we couldn't have done it without you, right? Oh, wow. And I kept saying to folks when I was relaying the story, and I'll say it again, it wasn't about the money, right? But I felt like I had played such an insignificant role because it was the thing to do anyways, right? And I just wanted them to win. I wanted them to be able to move on with their lives, to be able to pick up their careers and sort of move from this very traumatic thing that had happened. But the fact that they had thought of me in that way, right? Yeah, I think to this day, it's still something that absolutely takes my breath away. But just that other people beyond yourself, beyond family, beyond the people that are closest to you, folks that I had worked with and we had good relationships in the workplace, they didn't owe me anything. They really didn't, right? But that they had thought of me in that way, I think was incredibly humbling. And so when I think of moments like that, and I am sort of in another situation or context, so I need to make a difficult decision, I'm always reminded that it's so worthwhile to do the right thing. And someone beyond yourself is always watching, is always acknowledging that this person did the right thing. They might not say it, sometimes they do. But again, it was just another vindicating moment that I wasn't just this problem child. I wasn't just, tweeting on my ass, if I'd say that. But yeah, it was incredibly humbling. And I think it just reinforced the sentiment within me that, yeah, I'm going to keep doing the right thing, even when it's just really difficult to do.
I love that because you do this not expecting anything.
Yeah. Yeah.
You do this because it's rewarding for you to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's freaking incredible. But the fact that you also got validating that process, not looking for it.
Exactly.
It is. And now you're in the public health.
Yeah.
You act as a public health strategist for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Essentially, that's how I like to call myself.
Yeah. It is a really cool tie, I must say. Could you explain to us what you do and also how you got into that space?
So prior to joining the Gates Foundation, I was a management consultant, right, at an MBB here in Johannesburg, and that was really just sort of an interim measure for me. So had left OK Africa, had spent a little under a year working for a startup that was doing really cool work with AI and machine learning on public health data, largely in the HIV and maternal child health space, but didn't see that there was an opportunity for real growth there, right? So all the normal sort of pain points that often come in the startup, it also didn't feel like the people who were at the helm of that organization or that startup were really invested in my growth. And so I then said, okay, I had always heard that, if you're trying to figure things out, you go into consulting. And so reached out to a couple of contacts, and then I ended up applying, got the role as an associate at this firm. But I was always clear I was not building a career in consulting. I was not on track to, hell, even become a manager or a partner or a senior partner. I just needed it to navigate my next, but also working for such a large organization with an international name. I wanted to leverage that just in terms of career growth and development, which I felt that environment could possibly give me, and also just leverage it for a really good exit opportunity. So I was clear going in that this is why I was doing it. And so I stayed there for about a year and a half. And again, from a values perspective, there wasn't an environment that really resonated with me, right? Um, but I was also clear that this is an organization that has been this way for 100 years. I was never there to change it, right? I was always there to sort of influence my immediate sort of circle of influence, learn what I could learn, grow in the ways that I wanted to grow. And then when the time was up, to then go. And oftentimes in consulting, there's often this narrative that you have to stay for about 2 or 3 years before you can get a really good exit opportunity or for you to become a really astute professional. And in my case, I didn't think that was the case, right? So it was the environment had become just so untenable for me in terms of my mental and my physical well-being. And I didn't see that changing anytime soon. I felt like my health overall was going to continue to be a trade-off for something that I didn't even really feel mattered from a work perspective, right? Um, there were other parts of the work that I could, sort of resonate with that I felt even to this day have made me a much sharper individual in terms of the professional space. I work super efficiently because of it. And I know how to navigate complexities because of it as well.
Right.
I think even my communication is part of that, right? Because you're really taught and it's drilled down, right? That you need to communicate top down, right? So you learn to kind of, become really sort of refined. And that is something I certainly appreciate, during my time as a management consultant. But I wanted to do work that mattered to me and that I had a profound respect for.
Right.
And so thankfully, having that, consulting firm on my CV really, I think, positioned me for the role that I now have at the Gates Foundation, right? Which leans a lot into strategy because we're a very strategy heavy organization. Everything we do at the foundations is strategy led. And so I think, my previous role consulting really set me up well for that. And so what I do now at the foundation, so firstly, the Gates Foundation really does a lot of work within global health and then development, right? And so health is really anything from malaria, TB, HIV, maternal and child health, immunization, all of that falls under the bucket of global health. And there's so many more under that. And then there's the economic opportunity bit. So looking at things that you can't talk about getting health in a substantially better place if you're not addressing some of the economic factors, right, that often influence that. So economic opportunity then encompasses things like agriculture, development policy, and financing, right? Because all of the stuff that we're trying to do, whether it's health, whether it's agriculture, whatever it is, needs money, right? So how are we thinking about financing for development? Um, it's also things like women's economic empowerment, right? Women's financial inclusion. We know that when women are active participants of the economy, we have much better outcomes, particularly for communities and also their needed households, right? So it's a bunch of stuff that the foundation does. That my specific role, I sit on the Africa team, and I have a cross-cutting role which looks at both the health component and the economic opportunity. And I particularly engage what we call our partners, the scale, on the continents if they are continental bodies or institutions, and that really help us scale up the kinds of initiatives and programs that we want to do across health and economic opportunity. And of course, it's more so within an advocacy space, right? So before you can even talk about we need to address, rural or remote parts of Nigeria in terms of children who have not received a single vaccination today. You need to talk about what are the enabling factors to make that actually happen, right? And so that's where advocacy comes in, right? And it largely focuses on policy. So, what are the kinds of policies that need to exist within a country or within regional blocks, whether that's SADC, East African Community, ECOWAS, or continentally to allow certain things to happen, right? And the second bit of that is the resource mobilization, right? As you're advocating for different programs and initiatives to be happening in any country, how are you also making sure that we're having conversations around financing mechanisms, right? And yes, governments have budgets, but in the same time, as we know on the continent, that we have a lot of debt. And a lot of, national budgets go towards servicing high interest loan debts, right? And so how do you also start supporting governments and countries, and especially their ministries of health or ministries of finance? One, to do a lot more with the money or the resources that they have, but also two, how do you, because we're a private philanthropy, right, that acts as a donor within the space, make sure that you're getting additional resources into the space?
Right.
And then the third bit of it is how are you supporting sort of the development around what are innovative financing mechanisms, right? Like, what does that look like? Instead of asking countries or partners or stakeholders for more money, how do you start thinking about how are some of the ways you can get new money, leveraging, different things that exist within society, with government and trade, all of those things. So that's sort of the sum total of what I do. I work for advocacy team. I lean in KB in terms of the strategy of that advocacy, but at a continental level.
Right.
And I create enabling environment. So I'm part of a team that creates the enabling environment for the work that the foundation does at programmatic level to actually happen.
I think it aligns more
It does.
with who you are and what you want to do.
Yeah. For me, it does. But I'll tell you, I get a lot of flack, especially when I started at the foundation.
Okay. What do you mean by Flack?
So, of course, the Gates Foundation, right? It used to be known as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, or basically changed to the Gates Foundation. But of course, billionaire Bill Gates, founder of Microsoft, and his wife Melinda, that essentially set up the foundation together.
Right.
And they had a vision for these are some of the world challenges that we want to tackle, and given the resources that we have, right? How can we make dents in some of these, areas, right? Um, and so when I started at the Gates Foundation, and it's something that I didn't navigate at really large organizations that are often either constant in controversy or have figures that people often think are controversial, right? And so certainly experienced that, a little bit of that when I was at the consulting firm that I was at, right? Because they're typically in the media for a couple of things here and there, but never at the scale that I experienced at the Gates Foundation. And Gap was just read critiques about, how can you work for this person? And it, for me, initially, I think I wanted to engage folks in good faith, because when I engage in one, it's always from a place of good faith. But at some point, stopped engaging with certain individuals because, again, the narrative was sort of hyper focused on this individual who sit at this foundation that does profoundly different work from his sort of commercial enterprise, right? That has a team of over 2,000 individuals, right, who have chosen in some way to dedicate parts of their lives, right, because they believe in the work. And also, anyone who knows me understands to some degree why I do the things that I do and why I want to do the work that I do. Because again, the story of my dad will always be at the center of that, right? And so there were individuals that I really, butted heads with that oftentimes were not respectful. And it wasn't an inability to engage robustly, right? Because again, it's all about nuance, right? You can acknowledge that you work for an Amazon, right? That is also helmed by a billionaire who at times can be seen as a controversial figure. but the work that you actually do at Amazon, right, contributes to something very specific, right? The work that I do at the foundation isn't Bill Gates' work, right? And I always say to people, if you really want to understand the work that I do, ask me, what do I do every morning when I open my laptop, essentially? What am I talking about when I'm in a meeting? And essentially, it's if I'm given a certain amount of money and we need to program this money on the continent, say, what are the greatest needs on the continent, right? Where are we seeing that governments can't realistically, with their resources, attend to that, but it's still a critical thing, right? Where can we work with other actors in the space to contribute to good, right? I am making decisions alongside other colleagues, right, within a greater team about where we're putting money um, to have the greatest impact and change, right? And so when people are unable to sort of remove the work that we do from the figure who, in essence, started this foundation, I'd almost want to have I guess, a conversation that centers around who the person is, how they perceive him to be, some of the controversies that they feel he's been embroiled in. It's not particularly productive for me, right? Because I am there because I want to do a certain kind of work, and I can talk about how impactful that work actually is. I can give you figures and say, because we put this amount of money in this specific program, some kid who otherwise was not going to be able to receive vaccines, who might have had polio in an age where polio by now should have been eradicated, right? That is money that has materially changed the life of one person. And even how the foundation defines impact, right? It's the number of economic opportunities created and the number of lives saved, right? And that is something that means something to me beyond the media scrutiny and the hub and the flurry around the founder of this foundation. And I think there is a separation between the two, who he is and who he is perceived to be, and this foundation that he and his wife or his ex-wife had built, and just the multitude of people with similar values to myself who want to see good happening in the world, banding together and say, we're going to do this difficult work. So I got a lot of, very interesting opinions, which I didn't mind because people have opinions. I have opinions, right, about the founder of our own organization. I think that's a human thing. But I think when the engagement is then out of bad faith, right, it's constantly about knocking what you're doing. It's not wanting to understand the work that you're even doing. At a certain point in time, there are individuals with whom I would engage and feel that it's just tremendously disrespectful. And I've lost a friendship, as a result of that, right? And them having a partner who wasn't particularly respectful of me, but also the work that I do at the foundation. So I'd learned when, people ask me, hey, what do you do? And, what do you think? How do you balance the tensions of some of these days? How does someone who works at a Facebook balance the tensions of some of the controversies that often surround a Mark Zuckerberg, right? Or in the instance of an Amazon or Google, whatever the case is, right? How do you balance some of those oftentimes tenuous narratives with the work that you actually do? Right. And I think if people were more interested in what is it that you do and why is it important to you, I think that's a far more productive engagement versus, oh, I read this book and it said X, Y, Z, and how can you sit in a meeting with that man? And you're like, well, I actually haven't met this man. I probably would. But I can tell you about the work that I do. I can tell you the work that the Africa team does. I can tell you about this, colleague. I can tell you about this program. I can tell you about the woman farmer that has been empowered to be able to now have her own enterprise and is changing the lives of individuals in her community because I and the team decided to make an investment into that program. Right. And so, yeah, I mean, that's what the work means to me. And that's how I often, explain it to people. But I have gotten flack and I often get, the odd eyebrow raised. Oh, you work for this person. But I've learned to sort of just let it roll off my back. Right. Because it's not about him. It really isn't. It's so much bigger than him. If it was about him, it would be a foundation of one or a foundation of two. Right. And it isn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's really tough. I think people tend to, it's easier for them to criticize what other people do. Is actually have like, a lot of times it's more about a projection, an insecurity about themselves rather than saying, hey, um, what you're doing is wrong.
Yep.
You know? And I think that's where you're right. It's in bad faith. it's not a productive conversation. Is there a piece of advice that you would like to give, you would have given yourself, that would have helped you get through these times?
I think probably the only thing that I would say to my younger self is there is an article I read years back, and it was talking about how you manage stress and anxiety, right? And I remember it had very specific line. It said, the anticipation of an event is often far more extreme than the event itself, right? And I love it, right? And I loved it at the time as well. But I think my interpretation of it, right, has gotten me into a little bit of trouble ever since. Because I think what the author or the writer made was oftentimes you stress and you're anxious about this thing. And by the time the thing happens, you kind of breathe a sigh of relief and you're like, oh, it wasn't that bad, right? But what I took that to mean was if I constantly preempt something, constantly anticipate it, right? Then I'll be in a better mental space for when that thing happens. But what I found to be true is actually the opposite. I often end up being stressed and anxious about the thing, then stressed and anxious about the thing when it happens or when it doesn't happen. And it almost feels like you're experiencing something stressful or anxiety inducing twice. And it can do a number on your mental health, right? And so I often find I'm a very much scenario based person. I'm always like, what is the best case scenario? What is the mid case scenario? What is the worst case scenario? And I'm always planning for the worst case scenario because in my mind, if I'm reasonably preempting it and anticipating it, and it won't be as bad. Right. But the turmoil, the mental anguish that I oftentimes go through in that anticipation and that preempting, even when that thing happens, sometimes it feels like when the thing happens, it's so less stressful than the build up up until that thing, right? So I think if I could tell my younger self, maybe one I'd say don't read the article, but if I were to still read the article, I would just emphasize to my younger self that you don't have to spend all your time worrying. And I'm a big worrier. I worry about everything. When I was trying to get into the estate and, I was texting, I don't want you to think that I'm late or, it's like it's a constant worry about very little things and sometimes very big things that warrant that kind of worry. But worry doesn't change anything, right? You're no better for having worried about something. And I think it's just about moderating it a lot more so that it's not something that really sort of brings about this emotional and mental turmoil. So I think that's something I would have told my younger self so that growing up and, coming into my adulthood, maybe that would be a practice that I'm a little bit more familiar with. So now I'm trying to do it now, trying to get a lot better at it. But yeah, it's still really difficult for me, this thinking that if I worry about something, I'm in control of it when it happens. I'll be okay, I'll be able to manage it. And all you do is you just end up worrying and stressing and being anxious twice or not thrice over, right? So I'm trying to sort of manage that now in my adulthood, but it's certainly some advice I would have given my younger self.
Yeah, there's something that's helped me with that kind of anxiety.
Yeah.
My mentor at Google, she said that clarity
Yeah.
is the solution to anxiety.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think it applies in the sense that, a lot of times we build things up in our head, but when you're able to kind of understand what you can't worry, what you don't have control over,
Yeah.
and the things that you do have control over, you start to understand what you can leave alone and the things that you can start acting on. Yeah. And I've kept that so close to me because I think as you're trying to do many different things, there's a lot of uncertainty. And that's really helped me. And I love that you mentioned, that you don't have to worry. It is a choice. I know easier said than done.
Absolutely. Yeah,
Absolutely. It is simple, but it's not easy.
Yeah. I do think that's one of my superpowers because even at work, I was strict so situations. They're just the ability to maintain calm, right? And composure. It's really great because it's also reassuring to others. You come across as being confident, but interns, I want to.
I did want to ask you, so you're South African Zimbabwean.
Yeah.
Did you have I would say any identity issues. And the reasons I say that is, I was born in South Africa.
Yes.
And I've always felt like I've never been a part of anything.
Yeah.
I felt foreign no matter where I went.
Yeah.
And I think we were having this conversation before where we got into this podcast. But when I went to Korea, I felt foreign. When I was here, I felt foreign.
Yeah.
But it kind of played a, uh, a weird role in my life in the sense that I never wanted to be a part of any sort of clique.
Yeah.
But I did want to ask you, how was that journey with you?
Yeah.
Being a South African Zimbabwean.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was awful.
Please.
This was awful. And I mean, so I was, born in South Africa and, parents were Zimbabwean descent. So naturally, then you're Zimbabwean, South African or South African, Zimbabwean. And I remember when, part of being teased, when I talked about being teased and bullied in school, was around my heritage. And so I remember most of my primary schooling was in the Eastern Cape. And it was just so bad. I would be teased about how dark I am because being dark is always, associated with being a foreigner, especially you're black. And of course, I didn't speak the official languages, the fluency of kids who are South African native, right? So I could speak Xhosa, could speak Zulu, and I had, right? But because I am not Zulu and I'm not Xhosa, right? I have a little bit of an accent, as many people do when they're seeking a language that is not their mother tongue. And I get teased, Um, and there was a point in time I actually decided to actually completely dissociate with my Zimbabwean heritage. And so I didn't go by Rufaro. I hated that name. I always said to my mom, I don't understand why you named that, named me that to begin with. And so I went by my middle name for a very long time, Catherine, right? Where people would ask me, do you speak Shona? I'd say, no, I don't. I just speak English. Completely dissociated with identity, right? And it's not up until I got to third year university. Third year university. So there are very many people who are part of my primary schooling and secondary schooling life that still refer to me as Captain, especially if they hadn't seen me in a long time. Now it's like, so it's Rufaro now, right? I don't go by Catherine. But I completely divorced myself from anything I felt would identify me as being remotely Zimbabwean, right? But by the time I got to third year, I always say university was so liberating for me in so many aspects because now if you were the kid that was bullied and didn't have friends in high school or all your life, essentially, you not really cared about that university, right? You're just a student, you shut off the classes, and you'd in essence then have people gravitate, or you would gravitate towards certain people. I didn't find at least university to be kicky in the way that high school was or in the way that primary school was. And so it was so liberating to finally have people with whom I was friends that I liked and who liked me for exactly the way that I was. And I think because of that freedom that I felt, I then became Rufaro, right? So slowly eased into it. I think I wrote an article about it. I must have because I wrote an article about it. Okay. But I think I wrote about just what my name meant to me and how I had just sort of discarded it for very many years and why I had done that. And this constant existential crisis where you're like, but I am South African. I was born here. This is all I know, right? The politics, the inside jokes, the language, everything. All I know is this, right? And Zim, yes, is the place where, my heritage is from. A lot of my family still in Zim, split across other countries in the world. But that was the place that we often went to during school holidays, or maybe if there was a funeral or a wedding. But home, especially when I was a kid, had always been South Africa. When we would leave Zim, it would be, oh, we're going back home.
Right.
And as I've gotten older, now it's when I go to Zim, I'm going home. But equally, when I'm coming back to SA, I'm going back home, right? But it was awful. And I was only able to reconcile my identity or start reconciling it in third year university. And, in my adulthood, it's then this navigation of, South Africans are, yes, particularly warm people, right? That's something that we hear, world over. South Africans are so warm. But also South Africans, and I say this generally, right? There is unfortunately a very large or pervasive sentiment around xenophobia. Right. And it's not just limited to, because, back in the day, it was just like, oh no, these are quote unquote township sentiments. No, that's not the case, right? It's middle class, educated folks. I went to university where would say disparaging things about foreigners. Um, People that I've worked with in the workplace, people in senior leadership have said disparaging things about foreigners, right? And I think what's particularly insidious about the kind of xenophobia or Afrophobia that exists in South Africa is that there's almost a sentiment that even if you are here legally, you're documented, you were born here, it's not enough. And there's almost a sentiment that, especially as a Black African national, right? Less so if you're not Black, because then there's an interesting dynamic there, right? You're an expat or you're a tourist, right? Um, it's this idea that you can't be a Black African national who is not South African native um, and possibly be here legally, right? And that's something that I've had to contend with, and I'm still contending with even up until now. When I do a bunch of travel, right, in my job, I am always at airport, always on a plane, flying to somewhere. And my greatest anxiety is South African immigration. I have a South African passport, I have a South African ID, I have South African birth certificate that I was born here. But every time I get to the counter, the immigration officer will look at my passport and he'll say to me, a Rufaro Samanga born in South Africa?
Yeah.
And I've often gotten grief about that, right? Where it's, your name is clearly not South African, right? It's clearly Zimbabwean. How could you possibly have been born in South Africa, right? Or why do you not have South African citizenship, but your passport says born in Zimbabwe? And, my mom has always said to me, no, you remain calm. But sometimes it really depends on what mood you catch me on. If I just been on a 24-hour flight, and I get to the counter and you say something off to me, it can rile me up because it's almost like you constantly have to defend what you are and who you are, right? And I am South African just as much as I am Zimbabwean, right? But the fact that I always had to defend my South Africanness in South Africa is something that has always been, I think, hurtful for me, right? And so with the immigration officer, sometimes it's just I keep quiet, or sometimes it's I don't know what you want me to tell you, right? I'd had my mom, when she was still in corporate and she would travel, being held up in little airport rooms, right? Interrogating the documents, right? Because how could you possibly be a legal citizen of South Africa?
Just based off the surname.
Based off of your name, right? And it's something that I continue to navigate. I have a partner who is Malawian. He experiences the exact same thing, and he's Malawian South African, whereas his father was Malawian, his mother South African. And same thing, has a South African passport, South African ID, all of those things. And he has dual heritage. So I actually don't have dual heritage. I'm just South African. And I've always wondered, should I get the dual heritage from the Zim side? But for the most part, I just, have my South African documents. But he has both. And every time they look at his name and they're like, how could you possibly be here legally, right? And the juxtaposition of that with white individuals who are from other countries, right? They're often seen as tourists or you're seen as an expat. They're never stopped randomly in the street or, at a roadblock and they're asked, "Oh, are these documents legitimate, right?"
I have never experienced that.
Yeah. And so I don't know. It's something that makes me sad. And it's often been the one thing I've considered in terms of, whether I will continue to stay in South Africa, right, long term. I've always said I want to stay on the continent, given the work that I want to do and the investments into African public health systems.
Nope.
I want to be on the continent to do that work. But I often wonder, and it's not that, I'm privileged in the sense that where I live and, where I work, all of these things, the fact that I have a little bit more money than the average South African, right, obviously buffers me in certain ways. And if I really had to encounter someone who was trying to make my life difficult, I could call a lawyer, right, and have it, sorted out quite quickly. But it's more so just at the heart sort of level, right, where you're like, people constantly make me want to make me feel like I don't belong, right? And I don't know how you get around something like that. So it's something that I struggled with all throughout my childhood. It's something that I'm still contending with even now. And I think it's something I'm going to continue contending with so long as I'm in South Africa. Um, I don't know how we get around it. There's certainly, and of course, I say this very generally, right? Because I had many South African friends who are absolutely amazing. They go to bat for me, and it's not a thing for them, right? I think it also just boils down to how you're raised, some of the things that are passed on to you, in what environment you sort of grow up in, where a lot of those sentiments are quite prolific, right? Or you don't have individuals in the space to check you on some of those, sentiments. Um, but yeah, it's been difficult. I know a couple of years ago, went onto Twitter when I was still quite active on Twitter, and I'd been randomly tagged by someone. Didn't know this person, didn't follow them, they didn't follow me. And they had taken screenshots of posts that I'd made in the past where I'm talking about my dual heritage joining South African-Zimbabwean. And I remember it was under the hashtag, I think it's Put South Africans First, which is a particularly xenophobic online movement. Um, and I just had all of these individuals dissect. People were saying the most ghastly things. I'll never forget. There was one, actually two men, don't know them from a bar, so who commented on the post, and they said, "Yeah, if we ever see her in a parking lot, we're gonna beat her up, right? These foreigners need to go back to where they came from."
Nice.
And it who knows, 24, 25. And it's what do you do? This is home for me. I care deeply for South Africans because I consider myself South African in the same way that I care deeply for Zimbabwean people because I am Zimbabwean, right? I speak the language because I was born here. I speak a number of languages at that. And I still speak my home language, right? Which is Shona. But I don't think there's anything that I can do as an individual to ever rise to this level of enoughness, like you are now enough of the South African. And equally, there are Zimbabweans who feel like when I refer to myself as South African Zimbabwean, oh, but you can't be both. You're just Zimbabwean. South Africa is just a place that gave your family an opportunity. It's like, no, South Africa has been my lived reality across so many things, right? Less so in some ways, Zimbabwe, right? But I have often just focused it back to I am quite comfortable with my dual heritage. And while that's a contentious issue here, when you look at places like the States, right, where people are Mexican American or African American or Puerto Rican American, whatever the case is, right, there's an acceptance there around dual heritage. Of course, immigrants are generally still treated awfully, but that concept of having dual heritage or multiplicity of heritage is not as contentious there as it is here. So I've also then just had to kind of ground myself in what I know to be true. I am South African and I'm also Zimbabwean. And South Africa means something to me in the same way that Zim means something to me. And when I say I'm going home, depending on where I'm at, that could mean I'm going to Zim or it can mean I'm going to South Africa. My home and my life and all that I've ever known has largely been rooted in South Africa.
Right.
And the greatest good that I've wanted to achieve has largely been for South Africa, right? And less so Zim because I didn't grow up there, right? And I didn't experience very many things. I might be connected to it because I have family members that are there. And it's certainly still a case that's close to my heart because that's where my mom is from. That's where my father's from. My family, right? That is where I am from. It just so happens I was born in South Africa and then had another lived experience because of that. But I fully accept that I am South African Zimbabwean and I'm less interested in people validating whether they feel that that's the case or not. But it's something I know I'm going to continue to contend for most of my life. If I remain in South Africa, when I've traveled and I've got to Kenya and, other places on the continent, they're just excited. So, oh, where are you from? Now, oh, so you're also from Zim, but you were born in South Africa. And it's a point of curiosity and excitement for them in a way that the general South African population isn't, right? And so I do think South Africans are an incredibly warm people, but I do think that the scourge of xenophobia and Afrophobia is an unfortunate one,
Right.
but it is a very real one. And we know that there are so many lives that have been lost to xenophobic attacks. And every so often, given the political landscape, given, people who feel like it's something that they want to use to their advantage. Because always the story of the other, it's easier to say, this person is stealing from you jobs, opportunities, resources, all of these things, versus saying, we have not had good governance for a long time. We need to be accountable for that. That story of the other and the foreigner and the foreign national is always going to be there. And I think it's going to get worse, right? But I think going back to me as an individual, right? It's just accepting that I am what I am and I am who I am because of Zim and because of South Africa. And that's enough for me, even if it isn't for others. And even if it's something that they sort of put aside, they don't acknowledge, they refuse to acknowledge, or they kick back against. It's more about sort of the reconciliation I've been able to do within myself. And that's helped me with existential crises that I've had for most of my life. Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, I think, yeah, it is also very difficult when it has been a traumatic point in your life to be constantly reminded of that. And now, especially when you're at immigration,
Yeah.
you're getting reminded again.
Exactly.
And but I think you were able to find
Yeah.
what your identity is,
Yeah.
especially in this very um conflicting situation. So, and do you think that's helped you understanding where your heritage lies, who you're?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you're young and you're being teased about, oh, and I remember at the time, when I was much younger, probably, 10, 11, 12, that's when, Zim was still using the Zim dollar, but we were having major inflation issues. So it was like 1 million Zim dollars to buy a loaf of bread. We would get teased about things like that, right? Or you get teased about the fact that you speak Shona, right? It's just, this is the language that we speak in, our country. Um, I think having gone through all of that and getting to a place, 'cause as you grow, you learn a lot more about things, right? You learn a lot more about life and you meet a lot of people whose perspectives also help you to figure things out for yourself, right? I think all of that has just helped me, and some of the life experiences that I've had, friendships that I've had as well, have helped me come to a place where I hit a lot better about it, right? And knowing about Zim equally as I do about South Africa has helped as well, right? So it didn't become this relegated sort of like just thing in the corner. It's the place I was at beginning of this year to go bury my grandmother, right? It's where I went back to go and bury my father when he passed away, over a decade ago. Um, and when I'm there, I feel like I'm whole. There's something about being in a place where folks are speaking no language, right? The little sort of like nuances between people, even the way that people laugh, it's just, there's a sense of being home, right? And even when I'm back in South Africa, there's a familiarity of it that's a, oh, I'm home, right? So I think if nothing else, I think it's incredibly magical that you could come from two different places and they could still have the sense of home, knowing that there are people in this world who were born in a certain country and had never had a sense of feeling home, right? Even though that is the only country they know, they are from that place, maybe because of tribalistic reasons, right? You don't feel like you're South African enough, right? So I think it's absolutely magical, and it's something that I honestly have embraced. I embrace it, right? And I always say South African-Zimbabwean. And people say, where are you from? I always say South African-Zimbabwean because it feels like cheating myself by saying, well, I'm South African, right? Um, and I could never just say, oh, I'm a Zimbabwean. It has to be both, right? So I think now I'm more settled in that identity. And again, I think storytelling has helped me tremendously, right? Writing about some of these things in a very real way, writing about xenophobic attacks. And even from a fiction perspective, on some of the books that I've been working on in the background, right? When I was in grade 8, I think we had a really bad, that was the first sort of one that I was consciously aware of as a kid. We had a really bad xenophobic attack. And in the time, my family and I, we were still in Durban. And I was in Westport Girls, high school. I spent a lot of time at their library. And I remember on the front page of the newspaper they used to put out every morning in the library, there was a picture of this burning thing, right? And as I started reading the story, there was a Mozambican national, his name was Ernesto, who was living in a township And when the sort of xenophobic attacks erupted, very violent, number of people lost their lives. Like, I never forget that they took this man, right, would come from his country in search of work so he could send money back home so that his kids could have a better opportunity. They had, beaten him up, assaulted him, rolled him in a blanket, doused him in petrol and set him alight. And they had killed him. And I was 14 at the time when I read that. And I remember then being in class at the time, it was history, and a couple of girls were sitting around me. And they were laughing about how, foreigners deserve this because they continuously bring drugs into the country. These are other 14-year-olds that are saying this. And I remember crying in the history lesson because it just felt so unfair that anyone could ever justify any kind of harm, never mind killing someone because of where they're from. And I always say no one wants to leave their country, right? People, particularly in this day and age, when we look at, migration, people leave their countries. There's a lot of conflict on the continent. There's a lot of socioeconomic deterioration that we're seeing, political instability. People would otherwise want to stay within their own borders, right? There's something about being home and being amongst your so-called people, right? And yes, there are people who want to sort of explore the world and opportunities, but for the most part, the migration that we continue to see, especially with undocumented individuals, is really because circumstances have forced them to do that, right? No one crosses the Limpopo River knowing the dangers around drowning or even just animals or crocodiles that are there, right? And just the risk to their own safety because it's a casual thing that they woke up and decided to do for the sake of it, right? No one leaves their country to go to a country where they know they are going to be subjected to violence, right? That they might actually lose their lives for a job that probably pays them way less than they would have made in their own country, right? But they do it because circumstances have dictated that there is no other alternative. And the alternative is that you starve and kids starve and your family starve and you die, right? And so people make those decisions because they're forced into them. And of course, there's a conversation to be had about immigration and all of that, right? There's also another conversation about empathy. And we cannot observe everything that's happening in the world and think that it's okay for people to remain in those situations when we ourselves would not want to remain in in that situation, right? If there was a political moment in South Africa, God forbid, that then made it very difficult for South Africans to remain in the country, and they needed to go to a Mozambique, a Malawi, or wherever, right? One, just given what's happened between South Africa and a lot of these countries, right? South Africa and Nigeria do not have good relationships because of often, xenophobic attacks that are specifically targeted amongst other nationals, Nigerians, Zimbabweans, people of Pakistani and Bangladeshi, Somali descent, right? What would South Africans do in that instance? It's a very human thing to say, let me go where I might not be in danger. Let me take my family to safety, right? And so this idea that this is only happening to South Africa, people only migrate to South Africa, and that there isn't real reasons behind doing that, when so much is in stake, I feel like there's so much more dialogue to happen, around that. And it doesn't help that we unfortunately have politicians who do stoke the embers, right? And use xenophobia and Afrophobia as a political tool, right? To advance their own agendas. But I think for the rest of us who observe these injustices, right? It's so important for us to interrogate when these sentiments come up. Why do you think that, right? And if you were in a situation like us, reasonably, what would you do, right? And it's about saying this, we can navigate the challenges that come with maybe migration in a country not being able to realistically and operationally, right, be able to sort of take in a certain number of migrants. Fair enough, right? There's a conversation around due processes and legalities and all of that, right?
Right.
It's And I think oftentimes when we talk about having empathetic dialogues around migration, immigrants, and then xenophobia, people think that you're trying to sort of subvert the laws of a country. That, oh, it's okay that people can just come into. I think there are many things that can be true in once, right? We can talk about borders and all those things and legalities and, what is the right way to come into a country. But we can also talk about the very real reasons that are pushing individuals out of their home countries in search of better. And as we see political instability and fragility on the continent continue to rise of ongoing conflicts, we're going to see that migration become even more, right?
Right.
And individuals are heading to South Africa. I guess my worry is we're going to continue having these flares, these instances of xenophobia and Afrophobia, coupled with sort of the political dynamic in this country. I don't know where that all gets up to,
Yeah, thank you so much, Rufaro. This was an absolute blessing just to have you, your presence and your thought processes, everything. I'm learning so much. So I'm so humbled to even have this chat with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. And I want to say I am Rafaro of you. I haven't said it already, but I'm extremely of you, ever in pursuit of curiosity. Um, yeah, and I know this is gonna be big, and I'm so honored to have been your first guest. I'm so absolutely honored that I'm extremely proud of you. And I know you're gonna have a bunch more exciting guests, and really just rooting for you. Really good.
The first one will be the one that I'll remember the most.
Well,
And I hope to see you again on this podcast.
absolutely.
And yeah, I wish you the best of luck for your PhD and your work. Yeah, thank you so much.